Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Widowhood greatly impacts both the individual and the family involved, triggering emotional, psychological, and physical challenges. Family dynamics shift as everyone adjusts to the new changes, affecting the overall mental and physical well-being of the entire family. Now, today's guest is a professor of sociology and director for the Center of Innovation in Social Science in Boston University. She has written numerous journal articles on this topic, as well as joined studies in this area of widowhood. Dr. Deborah Carr, thank you so much for joining me, Deborah.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, the amount of studies that you've done on this area and looking into widowhood, looking into the changes that it impacts, do you have a favorite study that you've done that you could tell us about?
That's a good question. Our studies are like children, we love them all in their own special way. There's one study I have that's actually not been cited as widely as some of the others, but it's actually one of my favorite. And it's one on death blame, which is a topic that no one really studies or talks about. But we live in a day and age when people are very aware of those things that will hasten our death, like smoking or drinking or excessive weight gain. And so this study explored how do people manage emotionally the death of a loved one when they feel that that loved one actually did engage in behaviors that hastened their death. Things like, again, smoking or eating unhealthy foods or not listening to doctor's orders. And what we found is that they're not sadder or more grief-stricken, but they are angrier. And they do have this kind of a little bit of resentment that is tinged with the grief. And that can make it very difficult to manage the emotion of the loss.
That is a very interesting study because when you think about it, that happens a lot within amongst families as well. If sort of one person isn't really taking control of their own healthy habits, trying to make sure they're clean eating, especially after doctors have sort of told them again and again to watch what you eat, to watch the amount of exercise that you're doing. And for when something happens to them, it's sort of just in a sense of, oh, you've done that to yourself, but also I'm sad that you're gone kind of conversation. And that must be a really psychologically difficult thing for the family that's grieving to sort of balance between being, oh, this is something that you could have done to make sure that you didn't do that, but at the same time, but they're not here anymore, so I still have to be sad about it kind of thing. So that's a really interesting study. Thank you so much for mentioning that.
Yeah, thank you. And kind of as you hinted at, there's just a lot of really complex emotions when someone dies. And one hand, you're deeply saddened about the loss. In some cases, it might be a little anger or resentment that this beloved spouse who you told 50 times to quit smoking didn't quit. And then sometimes there's a little bit of kind of guilt or remorse. If only I had tried harder, if only I had, been more vigilant in telling them not to drink or not to get in the car without a seatbelt on. And so I think that's really hard. Older adults or younger adults for that matter, shouldn't feel guilty when their loved one died. And, you see that certainly in the cases of suicide, right? It's very hard to accept the fact that there's nothing you could have done to have stopped the death. And thinking that you could have, it's just an emotion that's not going to benefit anyone, not the survivor and not those other living family members.
Mm-hmm. So can I quickly ask before we get started, how did you get into wanting to look into widowhood and bereavement and these difficult areas that you don't really have sort of the normal conversations about?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. And I get it a lot. And people usually phrase it as, you're such a good-natured, happy person. How can you study death and widowhood? And, my quick answer is death and bereavement is the one outcome that every single human being will experience. We will all die. and all except for those who are incredibly socially isolated will have to manage the pain of loss. And so I think it's an incredibly important topic. And how I got into it is a little bit of kind of family background, a little bit of happenstance. In graduate school, I studied aging. That was the topic I was interested in. And when I started a new job, one of my new colleagues said, hey, we have this data set that has interviews with, hundreds of widowed people. And we know that you're interested in aging. Would you be interested in analyzing this very large survey of bereaved spouses called Changing Lives of Older Couples study? And I said, absolutely. One, I'm an aging researcher, but two, my father died relatively young, which meant, my mother was widowed relatively young. In my hometown where I grew up, a lot of my friends had a dad die quite prematurely. So even as a young person, I had just kind of questions. Is it worse for the family if your dad just drops dead suddenly and unexpectedly? Or if you watch him suffer a long, slow illness, what is better for the family? And so those were questions I actually had even as a young person. And so when this opportunity was presented to me to really just pose questions about widowhood and who does well and what can we do to help people, my answer was an immediate yes. And when you write one paper, it just generates more questions that you want to answer. And so it all kind of snowballs in that way.
And then it's suddenly leading into now talking about all these different studies that you've taken part in and led as well. So no, it's an amazing journey to sort of go from a personal discovery and a personal interest to lead straight into doing numerous different studies in so many different areas now. So no, thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, thank you.
Now, thank you so much for the introduction as well. Before we get deeper into it, I'd love to get to know maybe some of your recommendations and some of your interests by playing a little icebreaker to help us get warmed up before we ask the tougher questions.
Sure.
So to start off with, do you have a favorite book that you could share with us?
Oh, favorite book. So many. I love to read, and I will recommend a book I enjoyed recently that's not an academic book. It's just a very lovely book called The Matchmaker's Gift. And it was a novel about kind of a young woman divorce lawyer, and she discovers her grandmother's letters. Her grandmother had been a matchmaker, and kind of the convergence of these two women's lives, this intergenerational story. And so it was kind of an uplifting story about kind of family and love. And, there's always a little bit of bereavement in most novels. But I kind of like those stories about women's lives and relationships, and how they find love and lose love and then recover from that.
So are you a big Jane Austen fan, I might ask?
I am, yes. And of course, we could debate for hours the best Pride and Prejudice and who is your favorite, right? Darcy. But absolutely. I love those stories. When you think about just how old they were, right? It just shows this kind of persistence of human emotion and attachment. It doesn't matter if it's today or 200 years ago or kind of 2,000 years ago. Those emotions are very, very classic, right? That all experience.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think especially the book Sense and Sensibility as well, where it sort of talks about how women sort of go through the loss of a father, but also they're having to climb up a social ladder in order to quickly find their way back into the amount that they used to have or the luxury items that they used to enjoy. But they can't because society is sort of, it's like, well, that's their only male person that was around the household and living in the household, and now 3-4 women are having to struggle by themselves in order just to get by. So yeah, when I talk about bereavement and loss, I love sort of going back to Jane Austen, especially Sense and Sensibility, and having that deep connection to it.
And there's a lot of bereavement in there, right? Obviously, the father. So you had these young women who couldn't earn for themselves and they had to really scrimp and save. But then also kind of the Colonel Brandon character, right? Here was a man who had lost his wife, and he found love again, right? And it was a love that, the female partner was a little reluctant, a little wary at first because he was older, but they had this kind of deep bond. And so there are those stories. And the data mirror it that when people are widowed younger, for the most part, they do find no new romantic partnerships. And as they say, the love is never the same as their first spouse or partner, but it does give this message that really people can bounce back from anything.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right in that case. And there's so much that we can sort of lean into as an example of sort of dealing with loss and dealing with grief. Now, to tie into that, do you have a favorite movie that you could share with us in any area, in any genre?
Oh, that's a good one. Most of the movies I like are kind of pretty uplifting ones. And I don't know if this will ruin my academic credentials, but I just love the rom-coms. Legally Blonde is a favorite. When Harry Met Sally. I will watch them any time of day that they are on television. But I think it's usually the one thing I enjoy in a film. I had to think about it, kind of similar to the Jane Austen, is kind of a strong female lead that, of course, she often finds love at the end, but she also can maintain her career, or she can also maintain her friendships, right? That she's not kind of wholly folding her life into her partner. Because we know if someone does wholly fold their life into a partner, it's that much more difficult when they no longer have their partner around. So those are kind of two of my favorite rom-coms that I will watch whenever they're on television or on, Netflix.
Oh no, I definitely love When Harry Met Sally. I think it's just a movie that I love the comedic aspect between the two of them being friends first and sort of making fun of each other and then suddenly really falling in love slowly and having that slow burn effect of, oh, you were right there the whole time. You were someone that I loved the whole time and didn't even notice it. There was also the other film, You've Got Mail, as well as one
I've
that I
also
always
seen that one many times. And that actually is also kind of Jane Austen like that. It was kind of this chaste courtship, as they would say, when they were communicating. And I think that's something that I think is very rewarding to see, right, in this day and age when people do lots of swiping left or right. I don't know which way because I am too old for that genre of dating. But really getting to know someone's personality and values and sense of humor. We those know that those are the things that help couples sustain in the long term.
Yes, no, I think so as well. And I think if you can be humorous over an email or over messaging without really seeing them constantly face to face, then I think that's a great way to start a relationship. I mean, I'm biased. I met my partner through an app, so I'm definitely biased through that. But I think it definitely had that communication before a lot of couples meet face to face, where they have that comedic understanding or they have that reliance on making sure they're secure in themselves as well, to sort of not read so much into an email or a text message and have that understanding that they're actually joking and things like that. So without body language, I think is a whole other way of communicating.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it is, there are these tests for relationships, if someone's choosing between two partners and the classic question is, who would you rather be kind of stuck in an elevator with that you have to converse with for 2 hours? And that's really, what sustains that shared sense of humor, kind of a rapport that just works really well, and being able to communicate effectively, because that's what matters in the long haul.
Yes, no, exactly. I completely agree with that. And I think You've Got Mail has got the greatest sort of love story involved in it as well. It's something that I go back into because it's so incredible as to the amount of lies that's sort of told between him and her, the fact that he knows who she really is, but she doesn't know who he really is. So yeah, if you haven't seen it by now, then I don't care if I'm spoiling it for you because it's definitely a movie that everyone has to see at least once.
Absolutely. A good soundtrack. And, it's kind of beautifully shot. They make the Upper West Side of Manhattan look beautiful. So it'll make a lot of your listeners down in your part of the world want to visit the Upper West Side of New York.
Oh, that is the dream. That is the dream for me to go and see, just to go and reenact some scenes from that film particularly. Now, when it comes to podcast, do you have a podcast that you've listened to recently or one that you would like to share with us?
I will hang my head in shame for listeners. I don't listen to podcasts, and I completely appreciate what people are doing on podcasts. It's just I often just don't have time, and I spent so much of my time writing. I have to listen only to music, but not words, or else that'll kind of mess up my writing.
Do you have a favorite music that sort of gets you in the mood for complete focus and writing that you could probably share with us then?
Yeah, definitely classical music. My go-to is Bach piano music. It's because it's just exquisite, but it's not so overpowering that it kind of makes me like forget about my work. It's just this kind of beautiful background music. Any kind of Baroque chamber music. It's just lovely and lilting and helps me to focus.
Yes, no, I can definitely agree with you there. I think classical music, Bach is one of my favorites. And I think because it has a lot of sense of my grandmother and I, we used to listen to that a lot in the car. And this is her most replayed album was all of Bach's music and the whole collection of it. So yeah, that's definitely one that I think I've gotten from her and I've gotten an interest from her as well. So no, I thank you for that recommendation as to how a lot of our audience can sort of keep track and keep focus.
Hope it works for them as well as me.
Now, I hope you are well warmed up for the harder questions that we're going to be asking in today.
I'm ready.
I know that everyone has a very different view as to what family is and sort of the importance that family holds in today's society. Do you have a definition for family that you could share with us?
I do. There's the standard definition of family that we teach in our intro sociology courses, which is people who are related to each other by law or blood. So, a biological relative or one through marriage or adoption. And so that's the classic definition. But today, we are absolutely expanding it to include what we call kind of families of choice, right? It could be a long-term romantic partner with whom one is not legally married. It can be a best friend's daughter who is like a niece. For the LGBTQ community, it's friends, right? Especially for those older adults who maybe were not treated so kindly by their own blood relatives 30 or 40 years ago when they came out. So my definition would be those people who one considers their family, right? That they provide some emotional support or uplift. And even if it's not in the eyes of the state, for many people, they view those ties as just as consequential and just as important as perhaps a legal relative who they see once every 6 years, or a blood relative who they have nothing in common with and no desire to spend time with.
So do you think that the importance of family has changed, or has it just sort of expanded as to what it is in today's society compared to 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think family is just as important today as ever. And I know there are always some, political pundits, often more right-leaning, who like to lament the death of the family. You hear this, the death of the American family, or perhaps, the Australian family. And I think the classic definition has been diminishing. Yes, people divorce today. And yes, people have children outside of marriage, or they cohabit with a partner without legally marrying. But people are making family the way that works for them. And so I think that's why family is just as important forever as ever. Everybody wants to give love. Everybody wants to be loved. And we all need other people. And as we get older and we have difficulty, with aches and pains or arthritis or dementia, we need those loved ones more than ever. So I would say family is absolutely important today. On any national survey, if you ask people what is most important to you in life, family and friends almost always come up 1 and 2. It's just how one defines family has expanded kind of dramatically. And I would say that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to family, when it comes to love, there's also loss that sort of takes place. And today's episode is looking into the effects that widowhood has on not just individual family members, but the whole family dynamic as a whole. Now, from your sort of personal view, or maybe professional viewpoint, can you explain how it affects the physical and mental health of the family?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think kind of the short answer is there's not a single answer, because everybody's affected differently. And I think it comes back to the definition of family we were just talking about. We all know someone, they had a spouse die or a parent die, and they honestly weren't that sad because this was a person who was unkind to them, or a person from whom they had a very distant relationship. So in those kinds of cases, sometimes the emotional pain is actually dulled. Maybe they'll have the same economic troubles if they lose a spouse breadwinner, but the pain isn't as acute. We tend to have the most strong emotional reactions, the deepest sadness, the most long-lasting sadness, when it was a very close emotional bond. A spouse who was a best friend, your soulmate, you spend all your time with. Or likewise, if it's a parent, often a parent who dies prematurely, that's really painful because children are adapting to, just growing up, and then they experience this profound loss. And that really puts a huge kind of a shake through the entire family, right? If you have a young widowed mom with young children who are now wholly dependent on her. So a long way of saying it really depends. And on average, yes, people feel sad. They often experience physical health problems, especially kind of heart-related pains because of the stress of the loss, but often the stress of leading up to the loss. And I think that's really important. Statistically, it's very rare for someone to just drop dead out of the blue today. And the data show that. Most people do die of chronic illness. And so that means when your loved one is suffering slowly from chronic illness and you are watching them suffer and giving them care, that's really, really stressful. So the stress and the kind of health implications also oftentimes can start before the person actually dies, right? You're weakened from being a caregiver. And then when that death happens, it just can be overwhelming.
So a lot of it is sort of the gradual, oh, I know it's coming. I know it's going to happen. I can't avoid this. So they start grieving pretty much early on at the beginning, while also sort of setting themselves up for either the financial strain that can sort of take place, the funeral that sort of needs to get planned beforehand. So especially if you know it is a terminal situation, there is that planning that goes ahead. Now, straight after the loss, is there some sort of immediate, maybe emotional challenge that a family sort of goes through at that time? Maybe it could be the dynamic shifting very quickly, or especially if they lost a patriarch or a matriarchal part of the family as well, that's going to have some kind of emotional barrier between each of the dynamics that come in.
Yeah, there definitely are these kind of immediate shocks. I mean, one is kind of the shock of the loss. And I should say, even when someone knew the death was coming, even with older adults, and they'll have a loved one with, congestive heart failure, almost to a one, they still say they were shocked when the death actually happened. And that's something we find a lot. Even if you know they're dying, there's nothing that quite prepares you for that moment. So I think there's that sadness that certainly kind of creates ripples. The other is that the family, on average, is forced to act as a cooperative unit really quickly, right? And not all families are happy families. So you have a group of people who are brought together who very quickly have to plan the funeral, who have to manage the estate, who have to, fly everyone home if the family's dispersed. And so there are a lot of tasks that are very stressful that need to be done in very short order when someone is already grief-stricken. So I think that's something that can provide kind of a jolt to the family. And then the other is that there are a lot of new things people have to do. Most of us don't know how to settle an estate, right? Or if you're a woman who's been married your whole life and you've never stayed in your family home alone, right? And now that your spouse is dead. And so there are these little things around the edges that people are learning new things every day that can be really quite tricky. And then another factor is deaths don't change family dynamics. And so if there is a family where there was one surly child or two siblings who fight all the time, that's not going to go away around the deathbed like it does in these movies like, oh, I love you, sister, I love you, brother. If they've been squabbling since they're 5, they're not going to be coming and making these peaceful moments when they're 40. And so sometimes that lingering family strain is brought to bear, and it can make it really difficult for everybody, whether it's kind of planning the funeral or figuring out what dress to put mom into the coffin. Like some of those same battles, that are longstanding can start to bubble up again.
And what are some really interesting points that you sort of don't really plan until the person dies? Say, for example, they're figuring out what they're going to wear in the coffin, figuring out what they're going to wear at the funeral. What are some other areas that they're not really used to the idea of having to think of until it's happened?
Yeah, I mean, one is a lot of the kind of legal issues, working with a lawyer and settling the estate. In some cases, if it was a very kind of traditional gender division of labor in the home, sometimes one spouse doesn't even know how to do the tasks their former spouse did. Like you will hear of older men, right? That, they don't know how the can opener works, right? They don't know where to buy their prescription medications, and nothing against the men. It's just their wife tended to do that. Likewise, there are some older women who will say they don't know where, the checkbook is, these kind of things. So learning everyday tasks, driving, right? If you weren't the one in the couple who did the driving, you have to kind of manage this now, kind of driving up the car. And these things sound really mundane, But I think they're really important to talk about because when we talk about death, we often think big lofty issues of heartbreak, and that's absolutely true. But for most older widowed people and even younger widowed people, they just need to be able to do the tasks to get themselves through the day. And if they were not doing those tasks previously, they just have them dumped in their lap. That can be really quite difficult. And then the other is just managing your life without your spouse. What is it like to be a single person? And how do you manage going to work? And how do you manage people asking you honestly stupid questions and saying stupid things? That's something you hear a lot from widowed persons, that they will be widowed a week and a coworker says, I have a nice new person for you to meet. Or they'll just say just silly things, and not out of malice, but none of us are really good about talking about death. So you have this bereaved person who's trying to be gracious, but also just some of these silly comments people make can cut like a knife. And so they're forced to put on a pleasant facade and kind of go about their business, even if they don't feel like doing it.
No, and I think it's a big part as well. I mean, there's one film called A Man Called Ove, and I think it's also a book as well that I read recently that I really connect with in terms of having that spousal loss or trying to figure things out and figure their life out as a single person, and socially shutting themselves out because maybe the wife was the social one, maybe the partner was the one who was always talking to people, and they just sort of stood there. And one of the studies that you also did was the effect of widowhood on older adults' social participation. So can you talk us through a little bit as to why that study was important, and mainly what are the aims of that study that took place?
Great. So several years ago, I did a study with a fantastic sociologist, Rebecca at University of Utah, and we were interested in what is the impact of widowhood on social engagement. There has been a lot written on psychological health and on physical health, but social engagement is so important, right, as a way to ensure that older adults are not lonely and not isolated. So we looked at two dimensions of social participation, and one is generally called formal participation. So that's things like going to religious services, joining a club, things that are quite structured. And then the other dimension is informal. So that's things like visiting friends, going to a movie, visiting family. And what we actually found is that social participation for many increased actually rather than decreased after widowhood. But the kind of trick was it was very low. Social participation was low prior to widowhood because most people had a spouse who had a terminal illness, right? That's what precedes death. And so when people were caregiving and they were experiencing kind of what we call anticipatory grief, anticipating the loss of their spouse, that is when they were less engaged with kind of formal activities. And then for many, they just kind of picked it back up again eventually after their spouse died. And like with a lot of studies, you find pretty stark gender differences, especially for the current generations of older adults who often had kind of quite traditional gender roles, that men tend not to engage as much. Their wife often was a lifeline to the world. She would have been the one who says, kind of, honey, we're going to go visit the grandchildren today. Let's go to this, church potluck. And so when the wife dies, the men often have a more difficult time kind of engaging. Whereas women are more likely to have widowed friends. We know that men die younger than women. That's just what the demographic data show. So your average widow has just many more widowed female friends than your average male widower. And so there are these different reasons that the paths kind of differ for men and women. And they do differ based on what one was experiencing before the loss, and especially that intense caregiving often puts a real damper on whatever kind of social engagement they might like to have before the spouse dies.
So sort of what would be the advice from that study that you would give? Would it be sort of still allow for social participation prior to, even if it is an anticipatory passing? Is it sort of the motivation to keep on trying to be as social as you can before that, to sort of maintain that routine before and have that can sort of continue on after the passing?
Yeah, that's a really good point and a good question. I think one recommendation is if the person who's the caregiver for the dying spouse, if there's someone who wants to go out and engage socially, but they can't because they feel too burdened from caregiving, that's exactly the place where friends or family could step up and give her what we call respite care, right? Give the caregiver an afternoon off to go to the movies, to go to dinner with his or her friends, so they get a little bit of a break. And that will, one, help their mental health in the short term, will also help them to feel more comfortable kind of reinvesting in their social ties. It might not work for everyone. There are some people, we may know personally that they would feel guilty, right, leaving their loved one, and they don't want to go to the movies. They want to stay with their partner. But to the extent that someone says they would like a little bit of a break, whatever family members can do, even if it's linking them up with what in the US they call kind of adult daycare, right? Giving someone just some caregiving assistance, that really can be very helpful for those who want that kind of engagement.
Mhm. Now, are there some cultural or maybe religious significant differences that you sort of added into that study to sort of have the difference in maybe the cultural aspect to or the religious aspect of families or widowhood sort of dealing with that loss?
Yeah, that's also a great question. There's so much variation kind of worldwide and across religious groups or, racial and ethnic groups and how people manage loss. And there's so many reasons why. I mean, one has to do with just different views that people have of the family, for instance, right? There in some cultures, like, the family does everything together and you do not bring in outsiders. You do not bring in paid caregivers because it might look like the family isn't very good if they're calling in, an outside helper. And we know that often can be very difficult for people. And there's been some interesting research in the United States that shows for, Latino women in particular, they feel very strong pressure to be that good family member who cares for everyone. But then it ends up really kind of undermining their physical and emotional health, for instance. So, we want people to live in a way that is true to their culture, but while also recognizing that there are some norms or cultural differences that just make it more difficult for others. I think that's kind of a really important issue. But there are some cultures that view death very differently, right? And there's really interesting work by anthropologists. In most kind of Western Judeo-Christian cultures, we view death as just this awful, sad thing. But in other parts of the world, they don't. They view it as kind of just a natural part of life and the belief that you'll all be reunited someday and that we should kind of celebrate those connections. And so there are a lot of just different cultural practices that do give people some support and solace. I think the main takeaway is people should do those things that make them and their families feel better. But if there's some cultural norm that feels really stifling, then abandon it, right? There's no rule book on how to grieve. People have to do it in their own way.
Mhm. No, I agree. And I think when you said everyone has to do it in their own way, there are some people who maybe, especially if they're a take charge kind of person, need to have everything sort of settled down before they're able to breathe, especially when it comes to women as well. I know when my mum was sort of going through a loss in her family, she had to make sure everyone else was okay, make sure all her cousins were okay prior to her finally actually grieving the loss because she needed to be the one to make sure that her mother was okay with the loss of her grandmother and making sure that the food was there, making sure that everything was prepped and ready to go before she could really take that step back and be feeling through the loss of the biggest patriarch in her family.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so important. I think as kind of listeners take away only one thing is that there's no one right way to grieve, and no one should feel an expectation to grieve in a particular way. That places way too much burden on the bereaved person. And so in the case of someone like your mom, that she probably wasn't sitting in a corner and crying. She was kind of buying the food, making sure everything worked properly. And there was probably someone who said, "Oh, she doesn't seem very sad," or "You seem to be holding it together really well," and judging people if they're not showing this over the top display of emotion. But not everybody works that way. I mean, there are cultural differences. There are certainly gender differences in how people show emotion. And some people show it by just investing in their work and trying to push through the problem. And, and then maybe they'll have a really sad day on, Mother's Day, Father's Day, the birthday of the person who died. And those tears might come much later. They might come 6 months later. So I think we need to recognize that people show emotion and feel emotion in their own way and on their own time clock, right? Not everybody is, going to be very emotional right away, especially if they feel they have other people's needs to tend to.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point, and that's something that I think everyone needs to be aware of in almost every family, because every family is not going to react to death the same way. Every family member is not going to react the same way to the loss of someone, even if it's someone that they barely know, or a grandparent they barely met. There's still going to be that grief that sort of comes in with that, knowing it's family members. Now, this leads us really well into the next section of the show, which is the practice and habit. Now, this is a practice that you recommend for a lot of our listeners who are going through the same situation. Now, what is your recommended strategy for family members to support the widow or widower in facing the challenges of widowhood?
Yeah, I think one is something that we just talked about, that kind of try to get an understanding of how they're grieving and allow them to grieve in the way that feels natural for that person. And I think whatever we can do to urge people not to pass judgment on how people grieve, because this is something that happens a lot. On one hand, they don't seem sad enough. They're not crying enough. They don't seem upset. They must not have really loved the person. Then on the other hand, sometimes you'll see a case whereby it's a quite distant loss. Like, so for instance, this wouldn't be widowhood, but let's say, a mom loses her best friend or her neighbor or even a pet. Sometimes people feel that others have disproportionate grief. Why are they so sad? It's only her childhood friend. It's only a pet. Well, we can't begin to understand the depths of someone's ties, right? We're not always privy to what those relationships are. So I think that's one general lesson that's not about doing, but sometimes it's about actually doing nothing. It's about not judging and letting people just feel the emotions you're feeling and offer, support as needed. I think another big one is, do provide support and assistance, but in the way that the bereaved person wants it or welcomes it. And some people are never going to talk about their feelings, right? And so you can say till you're blue in the face, how are you feeling? Let's talk about your feelings. And often for older men, it's like, I don't want to talk about the feelings, but maybe they want to retell funny stories. So listening and asking questions and finding out, what are the things that one wants to talk through. Sometimes that can be helpful, even if it's just stepping back. One thing I often do is just, even send someone an email if it's like someone distant and just say, I'm here to talk if you want to, or I'll step back, as kind of on your timeline, right? And then the other is something we talked about a little bit earlier, but we focus so much on the emotional, but the practical are really important. And saying things like, if you need anything, I'm here, that's kind of less helpful than actually saying, can I give you a ride somewhere? Can I pick up milk from the grocery store? Those very seemingly petty, very practical tasks. If it's, again, helping someone shovel their snow, offering to do practical tasks, that can go a really long way because it removes this whole stressor from the bereaved person.
No, I hate the phrase, let me know if you need anything, because that is used so often and it seems like empty words, because the minute that they try to take you up on that offer, it's, oh, I can't do it now. I'm busy now. I can't do it. So when you say the practical aspects to it, it's more like just having that direct conversation, like not like, can I get you anything, but do you want me to get groceries? Do you want me to go and get, because if you think about it, no grieving person is going to sit there and ask, oh, here's a list of things that I need you to do, or here's a list of things that I need help with. Can you help me? But if you go ahead and list out, oh, I'm going to go get groceries. Do you want me to drive you anywhere? Do you it's more like offering rather than asking, which I think is a lot more meaningful.
Yeah, and it takes the burden off the bereaved person, because it's like, what do I need? So I don't know what I need from the store. And sometimes, people will even do things like the meal train. If you have these, it has different names in different parts of the world, but it's like a web-based platform where people can sign up to bring meals. But sometimes that's not even helpful, right? You don't want all the food dumped in your door. And so what I've seen some people do is they'll set up just like an Amazon, not to do product placement, they'll set up a website for a vendor online whereby people can just order and have stuff sent to the house, even though toilet paper, toothpaste, stuff that you think they might need in case they just don't have their head around having to go to the grocery store. And so those kind of things are helpful. Rides can be helpful. Home repairs sometimes, mowing the lawn, doing little things that especially if it's an older widower, she's probably not going to do on her own. And then checking in on holidays actually is a good one. Being mindful of, is this your first Mother's Day, Father's Day, wedding anniversary, birthday without the person? Because that's a real sting, especially that first year. So even something like sending flowers, sending a card just to say, I'm thinking of you on this anniversary, that can go a long way so people feel that they're being looked after.
No, that's a big one. And I think that's something that you don't notice that often, especially if they're bereaving. They won't really share how they're feeling. And I've sort of seen that in my own grandfather as well. Sort of like you're not really noticing him because he's trying to downplay a lot of the grief. He's trying to downplay a lot of the emotion. But little did we know it was their wedding anniversary like a week ago. And then that's why he was a little bit shut in on that day, didn't want to go out or anything. So having that sort of idea of, okay, we still need to keep up with those dates. We still need to make sure Christmas, I think, was one of the big ones for him, sort of not wanting to be alone during Christmas because his partner was the only person that they usually spend Christmas together. So that first Christmas of him on his own, we made it an event. We made it a whole big thing because it was something that we knew meant a lot to him. Even though it didn't mean a lot to us, it meant a lot to him. And I think that definitely built our relationship up with him as well, where he started being okay to share stories about their days together, about what they used to do together on Christmas. So having those conversations and having those dates remembered, I think, is one of the greatest things that we definitely had ahead of time.
Oh, that's a great thing to do. And I think what you're doing is kind of building new traditions. That's another thing that families, kind of getting back to our early conversations about family, when someone dies, it's not just the widow or widower that's left behind. It's the grown children. It's the grandchildren. And given that in many families, it's the oldest generation is the one who hosts the Thanksgiving dinner, the Christmas dinner, whatever one's holiday dinner is, new traditions have to be built after a loss, right? And if it's the second parent who dies, now it's the children are all of a sudden the oldest ones in the family, and they need to create those new traditions. So I think that's another thing that can be helpful, thinking about ways to create new traditions that work in a cooperative way so everybody feels that they're contributing. And that's also something that can go a very long way, I think.
Those are some great pieces of advice. And I think we listed a whole bunch of things that families can sort of do together in order to have that care and have that attention on the positive parts that life still has, especially when it comes to the social participation aspect that we were just talking about a little bit earlier. And I think that definitely builds up this pain isn't going to last forever feeling to it, because there are still some things to look forward to. And when the importance of family, this definitely has the importance of family pretty much written all over it when it comes to dealing with loss and dealing with how to build a family afterwards and after the grief, after the loss, and what it sort of contains. So no, there's a great piece of advice. Thank you so much, Deborah, for sharing those. Now, this leads us really well into the last section of the show, which is the open mic. This gives you a chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about, or maybe something that we feel that we didn't get to discuss throughout the show. In the last minute or so, I'd love to give you the floor and share what's on your mind with us.
Sure. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot and researching lately seems like a pivot, but it actually is related. And it is climate change and the impacts of climate change for older adults. We know that the world is getting hotter and hotter, and there are more weather events. And that's a problem for everybody. But for older adults, it's a much bigger problem. Older adults with underlying health conditions are much more vulnerable to heat, Sometimes their medications don't work in the heat. And so whenever there's a major climate disaster, a hurricane, any kind of problem, older adults are the ones most likely to suffer. What that means is bereavement is one thing, but it also means that kind of we as a society really need to have our eyes and ears on older adults, those who are bereaved, right, who might need extra support, but even those who are living in a place that doesn't have air conditioning, those who are socially isolated, who maybe don't want to leave their home in the case of evacuation, or don't want to leave their home in a heat wave to go to a cooling center. So I think that's kind of one of the big challenges we have now. How can we as a society embrace and support older adults, some who are bereaved, some who aren't, as they manage just this tremendous health impact of extreme heat and other weather-related disasters that disproportionately hurt them.
It's something that we definitely don't hear that often, or we don't discuss in terms of when it comes to climate change. And we talk about how it affects the current world, the current generation, but when you talk about in terms of how it affects older adults, that's something that you don't really hear as a factor. So to have that as a huge discussion point is something that is definitely needed, I think, in today's society, sort of how that affects, especially the idea of affecting medication, and the medications don't work. Is there some kind of attachment to heat that disallows medications to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for people who live in very hot apartments, for instance, they have to keep their medications in the coolest place. But there are other factors. Older adults don't kind of sweat, they don't thermoregulate as efficiently as younger people. And so if we're really hot, we feel lousy, we'll kind of sweat it out. But older people don't do that as well. And then sleeping in the heat can be really hard if you have health problems. So again, there are just kind of a lot of issues. And then when people have dementia, or if they're alone, they might be afraid to evacuate their home. They might be afraid to go to the public cooling center. Again, it's another case. If someone doesn't have a spouse to say, hey, we're going to go to the cooling center, they might not go. And so I think all the challenges we've talked about loneliness with older adults and sadness and cognitive health problems, those really just are amplified and become all the worse by these kind of stressors and impacts of climate change and extreme weather events.
No, that's a really interesting topic, and I'm definitely going to look deeper into that after the show, because that idea that we've never really heard of before it always comes into my mind throughout the show. So that's definitely something that I would like to learn about a little bit more. Now, if our audience would also like to know about you, or maybe some of the work that you've done, are there places that I can send them to that I can link down below?
Yes, one is my webpage. And I don't know the address offhand, but I'm Deborah Carr at Boston University. And if you Google me, you will find lots of books and articles. And you can find, actually, if you go to my webpage, you can click on pretty much any paper I've written and it will be there. And so the address is https : sites sites.bu as in boy, ubu.edu/Deborah Carr, all one word. And then you'll see my smiling face and many, many articles and columns and essays and links to books that people might find interesting.
Oh, that's perfect. I'll definitely have that down below for everyone who wants to access that and find it very quickly. Definitely go and check out the study that I mentioned, which is the social participation, and a lot of the other studies that Deborah has taken part in, because they're amazing to look into. They're amazing to sort of use as resources if you're also wanting to discuss it a little bit more. And yeah, thank you so much, Deborah, for coming on to the show today and for sharing a lot of the topic and a lot of the ideas that you've spent years studying. So thank you so much for letting us pick your brain.
Oh, it was my pleasure. And thank you for a really lively conversation.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. Now, I hope you guys learned as much as I did when it comes to widowhood and how to sort of build up a family during the bereavement process. And I'll see you all in the next episode.
You've been listening to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.